and could all but see on his face the question the Banner General had asked. Who was he to have such a thing? I need a map of the Captain, if you have such a thing, Tally said. I can manage if you don't, but better if you do. The northwestern quarter of the country is what I'm interested in. You're favored by the light, Banner General, the man said, bending to pull a roll from the lowest level of the rack. I have the very thing you want. By accident, it was in with the Amadisian maps I was issued. I'd forgotten I had the thing until you mentioned it. Uncommon luck for you, I'd say. Perrin shook his head slightly. Accident, not Taviran work. Even Rand was not Taviran enough to make this happen. The colors whirled, and he splintered them unformed. Once Falloon had the map spread out on the map table, the corners held down by brass weights in the form of rocken, the Banner General studied it until she had her landmarks fixed. It was large enough to cover the table and showed exactly what she had asked for, along with narrow strips of Amadisia and Giladon. The terrain rendered in great detail with the names of towns and villages, rivers and streams, in very small letters. Perrin knew he was looking at a fine example of the mapmaker's art, far better than most maps. Could it be Taviran work? No, that was impossible. They'll find my soldiers here, she drawled, marking a point with her finger. They're to leave immediately. One flyer to Arakan, and no personal items. They fly light and as fast as possible. I want them there before tomorrow night. The other Morak Arakan will travel with the groundlings. I hope to be leaving in a few hours. Have them assembled and ready. Carts, Perrin said. Neild could not make a gateway large enough to accommodate a wagon. Whatever they bring has to be in carts, not wagons. Falloon mouthed the word incredulously. Carts, Tally agreed. See to it, Captain. Perrin could smell an eagerness in the man that he interpreted as a desire to ask questions, but all Falloon said, bowing, was, As you command, Banner General, so shall it be done. The outer room was in a different sort of turmoil when they left the captain. Clerks darted everywhere, sweeping frantically or beating at the remaining beetles with their brooms. Some of the women wept as they wielded their brooms, some of the men looked as though they wanted to, and the room was still rank with terror. There was no sign of the dead man, but Perrin noticed that the clerks moved around the place where he had lain, refusing to let a foot touch it. They tried not to step on any beetles either, which made for considerable dancing about on their toes. When Perrin crunched his way toward the outer door, they stopped to stare at him. Outside, the mood was calmer, but not by much. Tylee's soldiers still stood by their horses in a row, and Neild was affecting an air of casual indifference, even to yawning and patting his mouth. But the Suldam was petting the trembling Damani and murmuring soothingly, and the blue-coated soldiers, many more than had been there before, stood in a large cluster, talking worriedly. The Kyrianan and Tyrans rushed to surround Perrin, leading their horses, and all talking at once. Is it true, my lord? Gamail asked, her pale face twisted with worry, and her brother Barmanis said uneasily. 4 men carried out something in a blanket, but they averted their eyes from whatever it was. All of them atop one another, all smelling of near panic. They said he spewed beetles, and they said the beetles chewed their way out of him, and the light help us, they're sweeping beetles out of the door. We'll all be killed, and burn my soul, it's the Dark One breaking free. And more that made less sense. Be quiet, Perrin said, and for a wonder they fell silent. Usually they were very prickly with him, insisting that they served Fail, not him. Now they stood staring at him, waiting for him to put their fears to rest. A man did spew up beetles and die, but they're ordinary beetles you can find in dead timber anywhere. Give you a nasty pinch if you sit on one, but nothing worse. Likely it was the Dark One's work somehow, true enough, but it has nothing to do with freeing the Lady Fail, and that means it has nothing to do with us. So calm yourselves, and let's get on about our business. Strangely, it worked. More than one cheek reddened, and the smell of fear was replaced, or at least suppressed, by the scent of shame at letting themselves come so near to panic. They looked abashed. As they began mounting, their own natures reasserted themselves, though. First one, then another offered boasts of the deeds they would do in rescuing Fahil, each wilder than the next. They knew them for wild because each boast brought laughter from the others, but the next always tried to make his more outrageous still. The Banner General was watching him again, he realized as he took Stayer's reins from Carlon. What did she see? What did she think she might learn? What sent all the Rocken away? He asked. We should have come here second or third, she replied, swinging up into her saddle. I still have to acquire Adam. I wanted to keep believing I had a chance as long as I could, but we might as well get to the heart. That piece of paper faces a real test now, and if it fails, there's no point going after Adam. A frail alliance and small trust. Why should it fail? It worked here. Balloon's a soldier, my lord. Now we must talk with an imperial functionary. She imbued that last word with a wealth of scorn. She turned her bay, and he had no choice but to mount and follow. Almazar was a considerable town and prosperous, with 6 tall watchtowers around its edge, but no wall. Elias said Amadisian law forbade walls anywhere save Amador, a law made at the behest of the White Cloaks and enforced by them as much as by whoever held the throne. Balwer would no doubt learn who that might be now, with Ailron dead. The streets were paved with granite blocks and lined with solid buildings of brick or stone, some gray, some black, many 3 or 4 stories high, and most roofed in dark slate, the rest in thatch. People filled the streets, dodging between wagons and horse carts and hand carts, hawkers crying their wares, women in deep bonnets that hid their faces carrying shopping baskets, men in knee-length coats striding along self-importantly, apprentices in aprons or vests running errands. As many soldiers walked the streets as locals, men and women, with skin as dark as any tyrant, skin the color of honey, men as pale as Kyrienin but fair-haired and tall, all in brightly colored Shonchan uniforms. Most wore no more than a belt knife or dagger, but he saw some with swords. They walked in pairs, watchful of everyone around them, and had truncheons at their belts too. A town watch, he supposed, but a lot of them for a place the size of Almazar. He never had fewer than 2 of those pairs in his sight. 2 men and a woman came out of a tall, slate-roofed inn and mounted horses held by grooms. He knew her for a woman only by the way her long, split-tailed coat fit over her bosom, because her hair was cut shorter than the men's, and she wore men's clothing and a sword just like the other 2. Her face was certainly as hard as theirs. As the 3 cantered off west down the street, Mishima grunted sourly. Hunters for the horn, he muttered. My eyes if they're not. Those fine fellows cause trouble everywhere they go, getting in fights, sticking their noses where they don't belong. I've heard the Horn of Valir has already been found. What do you think, my lord? I've heard it's been found too, Perrin replied cautiously. There are all sorts of rumors floating about. Neither one so much as glanced at him, and in the middle of a crowded street catching their sense was well nigh impossible. Yet for some reason he thought they were mulling over his answer, as if it had hidden depths. Like could they think he was tied up with the horn? He knew where it was. Moraine had carried it off to the White Tower. He was not about to tell them, though. Small trust worked both ways. The local people gave the soldiers no more heed than they did each other, nor the Banner General and her armored followers. But Perrin was another matter, at least when they noticed his golden eyes. He could tell instantly when someone did. The quick jerk of a woman's head, her mouth falling open as she stared. The man who froze, gaping at him. One fellow actually tripped over his own boots and stumbled to his knees. That one stared, then scrambled to his feet and ran, pushing people from his path as though fearful Perrin might pursue him. I suppose he never saw yellow eyes on a man before, Perrin said wryly. Are they coming where you come from? The Banner General asked. Not common, I wouldn't say that. But I'll introduce you to another man who has them. She and Mishima exchanged glances. Blighty hoped there was nothing in the prophecies about two men with yellow eyes. Those colors whirled, and he dashed them. The banner general knew exactly where she was going, a stone stable on the southern edge of the town, but when she dismounted in the empty stable yard, no groom came rushing out. A stone-faced paddock stood next to the stable, but it held no horses. She handed her reins to one of her soldiers and stood staring at the stable doors, only one of which was open. By her scent, Perrin thought she was stealing herself. "Follow my lead, my lord," she said finally. "And don't say anything you don't have to. It might be the wrong thing. If you must speak, speak to me. Make it clear you're speaking to me." That sounded ominous, but he nodded, and began planning how to steal the fort route if things went wrong. He would need to learn whether the place was guarded at night. Bulwer might already know. The little man seemed to pick up information like that without trying. When he followed her inside, Mishima remained with the horses, and looking relieved not to accompany them. What did that mean? Or did it mean anything? Sean-chan. In just a few days, they had him seeing hidden meanings in everything. The place had been a stable once, obviously, but now it was something else. The stone floor had been swept clean enough to satisfy any farm wife. There were no horses, and a thick smell like mint would have overwhelmed the remaining scent of horse and hay to any nose but his or Elias's. The stalls at the front were filled with stacked wooden crates, and in the back, the stalls had been removed except for the uprights that supported the loft. Now men and women were working back there, some using mortars and pestles or sieves at tables, others carefully tending flat pans, sitting on metal legs above charcoal braziers, using tongs to turn what appeared to be roots. A lean young man in his shirt sleeves put a plump jute bag into one of the crates, then bowed to Tylee as deeply as the clerk had, body parallel to the floor. He did not straighten until she spoke. "Banner General Kirgan, I wish to speak with whoever is in charge, if I may." Her tone was much different than it had been with the clerk, not peremptory at all. "As you command," the lean fellow replied in what sounded an Amadisian accent. At least if he were Sean-chan, he spoke at a proper speed and without chewing his words. Bowing again, just as deeply, he hurried to where 6 stalls had been walled in, halfway down the left-hand row, and tapped diffidently at a door, then waited permission before going in. When he came out, he went to the back of the building without so much as a glance toward Perrin and Tylee. After a few minutes, Perrin opened his mouth, but Tylee grimaced and shook her head, so he closed it again and waited. A good quarter of an hour he waited, growing more impatient by the heartbeat. The banner general smelled solidly of patience. At last, a sleekly plump woman in a deep yellow dress of odd cut came out of the small room, but she paused to study the work going on in the back of the building, ignoring Tylee and him. Half of her scalp had been shaved bald. Her remaining hair was in a thick, graying braid that hung to her shoulder. Finally, she nodded in satisfaction and made her unhurried way to them. An oval blue panel on her bosom was embroidered with 3 golden hands. Tylee bowed as deeply as Falun had for her, and remembering her admonition, Perrin did the same. The sleek woman inclined her head. Slightly. She smelled of pride. "You wish to speak with me, Banner General?" She had a smooth voice, as sleek as herself, and not welcoming. She was a busy woman being bothered, a busy woman well aware of her own importance. "Yes, Honorable," Tylee said respectfully. A spike of irritation appeared among her smell of patience, then was swallowed again. Her face remained expressionless. "Will you tell me how much prepared fork root you have on hand?" "An odd request," the other woman said, as though considering whether to grant it. She tilted her head in thought. "Very well," she said after a moment. "As of the mid-morning accounting, I have 4,873 pounds, 9 ounces. A remarkable achievement, if I do say it myself, Considering how much I have shipped off, and how hard it is getting to find the plant in the wild without sending diggers unreasonable distances. Impossible as it seemed, the pride in her scent deepened. I've solved that problem, however, by inducing the local farmers to plant some of their fields in fork root. By this summer, I will need to build something bigger to house this manufactory. I'll confide in you. I will not be surprised if I am offered a new name for this, though of course I may not accept. Smiling a small, sleek smile, she touched the oval panel lightly, but it was near a caress. The light will surely favor you, Honorable, Tylee murmured. My lord, will you do me the favor of showing your document to the Honorable? That with a bow to Perrin, markedly lower than the one she had offered the Honorable. The sleek woman's eyebrows twitched. Reaching out to take the paper from his hand, she froze, staring at his face. She had finally noticed his eyes. Giving herself a small shake, she read without any outward expression of surprise, then folded the paper up again and stood tapping it against her free hand. It seems you walk the heights, Banner General, and with a very strange companion. What aid do you or he ask of me? Fork root, Honorable, Tylee said mildly. All that you have. Loaded into carts as soon as possible. And you must provide the carts and drivers as well, I fear. Impossible, the sleek woman snapped, drawing herself up haughtily. I have established strict schedules as to how many pounds of prepared fork root are shipped every week, which I have adhered to rigidly, and I'll not see that record sullied. The harm to the Empire would be immense. The Suldam are snapping up Marath the money on every hand. Forgiveness, Honorable, Tylee said, bowing again. If you could see your way clear to let us have... Banner General, Perrin cut in. Plainly this was a touchy encounter, and he tried to keep his face smooth, but he could not avoid a frown. He could not be certain that even near 5 tons of the stuff would be sufficient, and she was trying to negotiate some lesser weight. His mind raced, trying to find a way. Fast thought was shoddy thought, in his estimation. It led to mistakes and accidents, but he had no choice. This may not interest the Honorable, of course, but Surath promised death and worse if there was any hindrance to her plans. I don't suppose her anger will go beyond you and me, but she did say to take it all. Of course, the Honorable will not be touched by the High Lady's anger. Tylee sounded as though she was not sure of that. The sleek woman was breathing hard, the blue oval with the golden hands heaving. She bowed to Perrin as deeply as Tylee had. I'll need most of the day to gather enough carts and load them. Will that suffice, my lord? It will have to, won't it? Perrin said, plucking the note from her hand. She let go reluctantly and watched hungrily as he tucked it into his coat pocket. Outside, the Banner General shook her head as she swung into the saddle. Dealing with the lesser hands is always difficult. None of them see anything lesser in themselves. I thought this would be in the charge of someone of the 4th or 5th rank, and that would have been hard enough. When I saw that she was of the 3rd rank, only 2 steps below a hand to the Empress herself, may she live forever, I was sure we wouldn't get away with more than a few £100, if that. But you handled it beautifully. A risk taken, but still beautifully masked. Well, nobody wants to chance death, Perrin said as they started out of the stable yard into the town, with everyone strung out behind them. Now they had to wait for the carts, perhaps find an inn. Impatience burned in him. The light said they did not need to spend the night. You didn't know, the dark woman breathed. That woman knew she stood in the shadow of death as soon as she read Surath's words, but she was ready to risk it to do her duty to the Empire. A lesser hand of the 3rd rank has standing enough that she might well escape death on the plea of duty done. But you used Surath's name. That's all right most of the time, except when addressing the High Lady herself, of course. But with a lesser hand, using her name without her title meant you were either an ignorant local or an intimate of Serath herself. The light favored you, and she decided you were an intimate. Perrin barked a mirthless laugh. Sean Chan. And maybe to Viren, too. Tell me, if the question does not offend, did your lady bring powerful connections, or perhaps great lands? That surprised him so much that he twisted in his saddle to stare at her. Something hit his chest hard, sliced a line of fire across his chest, punched his arm. Behind him, a horse squealed in pain. Stunned, he stared down at the arrow sticking through his left arm. Mishima! The banner general snapped, pointing. That 4-story building with a thatched roof, between 2 slate roofs. I saw movement on the rooftop. Shouting a command to follow, Mishima galloped off down the crowded street with 6 of the Shanshan lancers, horseshoes ringing on the paving stones. People leapt out of their way. Others stared. No one in the street seemed to realize what had happened. 2 of the other lancers were out of their saddles, tending the trembling mount of one that had an arrow jutting from its shoulder. Perrin fingered a broken button, hanging by a thread. The silk of his coat was slashed from the button across his chest. Blood oozed, dampening his shirt, trickled down his arm. Had he not twisted just at that moment, that arrow would have been through his heart instead of his arm. Maybe the other would have hit him as well, but the one would have done the job. A 2 Rivers shaft would not have been deflected so easily. Kyrianen and Tyrans crowded around him as he dismounted, all of them trying to help him, which he did not need. He drew his belt knife, but Kamail took it from him and deftly scored the shaft so she could break it cleanly just above his arm. That sent a jolt of pain down his arm. She did not seem to mind getting blood on her fingers, just plucking a lace-edged handkerchief from her sleeve, a paler green than usual for Kyrianen, and wiping them, then examined the end of the shaft sticking out of his arm to make sure there were no splinters. The banner general was down off her bay, too, and frowning. My eyes are lowered that you have been injured, my lord. I'd heard that there had been an increase in crime of late. Arsons, robbers killing when there was no need, murders done for no reason anyone knows. I should have protected you better. Grit your teeth, my lord, Barmanis said, tying a length of leather cord just above the arrowhead. Are you ready, my lord? Perrin tightened his jaw and nodded, and Barmanis jerked the blood-stained shaft free. Perrin stifled a groan. Your eyes aren't lowered, he said hoarsely, whatever that meant. It did not sound good, the way she said it. Nobody asked you to wrap me in swaddling. I certainly never did. Neil pushed through the crowd surrounding Perrin, his hands already raised, but Perrin waved him away. Not here, man. People can see. Folk in the street had finally noticed and were gathering to watch, murmuring excitedly to one another. He can heal this so you'd never know I was hurt, he explained, flexing his arm experimentally. He winced. That had been a bad idea. You'd let him use the one power on you? Tylee said disbelievingly. To be rid of a hole in my arm and a slice across my chest? As soon as we're somewhere half the town isn't staring at us? Wouldn't you? She shivered and made that peculiar gesture again. He was going to have to ask her what that meant. Mishima joined them, leading his horse and looking grave. 2 men fell from that roof with bows and quivers, he said quietly. But it wasn't that fall that killed them. They hit the pavement hard, yet there was hardly any blood. I think they took poison when they saw they'd failed to kill you. That doesn't make any sense, Perrin muttered. If men will kill themselves rather than report failure, Tylee said gravely, it means you have a powerful enemy. A powerful enemy? Very likely Mishima would like to see him dead, but there was no way Mishima's reach could extend this far. Any enemies I have are far away and don't know where I am. Tylee and Mishima agreed that he must know about that, but they looked doubtful. Then again, there were always the Forsaken. Some of them had tried to kill him before. Others had tried to use him. He did not think he was going to bring the Forsaken into the discussion. He was throbbing. Nothing was just. Let's find an inn where I can hire a room. 51 knots. How many more? Light. How many more?
Chapter 13. Siege. "Push them!" Elaine shouted. Fireheart tried to dance, impatient at being crowded in a narrow cobblestone street with other horses and women afoot, but she steadied the black gelding with a firm hand. Birgitta had insisted she remain well back. Insisted, as if she were a brainless fool. "Push them, burn you!" None of the hundreds of men on the wide guard walkway wall, white streaked gray stone rearing 50 feet, paid her any heed, of course. It was doubtful they heard her. Amid shouts of their own, curses and screams, the clash of steel rang over the broad street that ran alongside the wall beneath the noonday sun, suspended in a rare, cloudless sky, as those men sweated and killed one another with sword or spear or halberd. The melee spanned 200 paces of the wall, enveloping 3 of the high round towers where the white lion of Andor flew, and threatening 2 more, though all still seemed secure, thank the light. Men stabbed and hacked and thrust, no one giving ground or quarter. Red-coated crossbowmen atop the towers did their share of killing, but once fired, it required time to ready for another shot, and they were too few to turn the tide in any case. They were the only guardsmen up there. The rest were mercenaries, save Birgitta. This near, the bond let Elaine's eye find her warder easily, intricate golden braids swaying as she shouted encouragement to her soldiers, pointing her bow to where reinforcement was needed. In her short, white-collared red coat and wide sky-blue trousers tucked into her boots, she alone atop the wall wore no armor of any sort. She had insisted Elaine don plain gray in the hope of avoiding notice, and any effort to capture or kill her. Some of the men up there had crossbows or short bows slung on their backs, and for those not in the forefront and engaged, 50 paces made an easy shot. But the 4 golden knots of rank on her own shoulder would make Birgitta the target of any of Amarilla's men with eyes. At least she was not actually mingling in the press. At least she... Elaine's breath caught as a wiry fellow in breastplate and steel cap lunged at Birgitta with sword, but the golden-haired woman dodged the thrust calmly. The bond said she might have been out for a hard ride, no worries, and a backhand blow caught the fellow on the side of his head, knocking him from the rampart. He had time to scream before he hit the paving stones with a sickening splat. His was not the only corpse decorating the street. Birgitta said men would not follow you unless they knew you were ready to face the same dangers and hardships they did. But if she got herself killed with this man-foolishness... Elaine did not realize she had heeled Fireheart forward until Casela seized her bridle. "I am not an idiot, guardswoman, Lieutenant," she said frigidly. "I have no intention of going closer until it is safe." The Arafellan woman jerked her hand back, her face becoming very still behind the face bars of her burnished conical helmet. Instantly, Elaine felt sorry for the outburst. Casela was just doing her job. But she still felt coldly angry, too. She would not apologize. Shame surged as she recognized the sulkiness of her own thoughts. Blood and bloody ashes! But there were times she wanted to slap Rand for planting these babes in her. These days she could not be certain from one moment to the next which way her emotions would leap. Leap they did, however. "If this is what happens to you when you get with child," Avienda said, adjusting the dark shawl looped over her arms, "I think I will never have any." The high-cantled saddle of her dun pushed her bulky Aiel skirts high enough to bear her stockinged legs to the knee, but she showed no discomfort at the display. With the mare standing still, she looked quite at home on a horse. But then Magine, Daisy in the old tongue, was a gentle, placid animal tending to stoutness. Luckily, Avienda was too ignorant of horses to realize that. Muffled laughter pulled Elaine's head around. The women of her bodyguard, all 21 of them assigned this morning, counting Casela, in polished helmets and breastplates, wore smooth faces, much too smooth, in fact. Without doubt they were laughing inside. But the four kinswomen standing behind them had hands over their mouths and their heads together. Elise, a pleasant-faced woman normally, with touches of gray in her hair, saw her looking, well, glaring, and rolled her eyes ostentatiously, which set the others off in another round of laughter. Kaiden, a plumply pretty Damani, laughed so hard she had to hold on to Kumiko, though the stout graying woman seemed to be having her own difficulties. Irritation stabbed at Elaine. Not at the laughter. All right, a little at the laughter. And certainly not at the kinswomen. Not very much, at least. They were invaluable. This fight on the wall was not Aramilla's first assault in recent weeks by far. In truth, the frequency was increasing, with 3 or 4 attacks coming some days now. She knew very well that Elaine had insufficient soldiers to hold 6 leagues of wall. Burn her! Elaine was all too aware that she could not even spare trained hands to fit hoardings to all those miles of wall and towers. Untrained hands would only bungle the work. All Aramilla needed was to get enough men across to seize a gate. Then she could bring the battle into the city, where Elaine would be badly outnumbered. The population might rise in her favor, no certain thing, yet that only meant adding to the slaughter. Apprentices and grooms and shopkeepers fighting trained armsmen and mercenaries. Whoever sat on the lion throne then, and very likely that would not be Elaine Trakand, it would be stained red with the blood of Camelin. So apart from holding the gates and leaving watchmen on the towers, she had pulled all of her soldiers back into the inner city, close to the royal palace, and stationed men with looking glasses in the tallest spires of the palace. Whenever a watchman signaled an attack forming, linked kinswomen made gateways to carry soldiers to the spot. They took no part in the fighting, of course. She would not have allowed them to use the power as a weapon, even had they been willing. So far it had worked, though often by a hair. Low Camelin, outside the walls, was a warren of houses, shops, inns, and warehouses that allowed men too close before they were seen. 3 times her soldiers had been forced to fight on the ground inside the wall and to retake at least 1 wall tower. Bloody work, that. She would have burned Low Camelin to the ground to deny Aramilla's people cover, except that the fire might easily spread inside the walls and spawn a conflagration. Spring rains or no spring rains. As it was, every night saw arsons inside the city, and containing those was difficult enough. Besides, people lived in those houses despite the siege, and she did not want to be remembered as the one who had destroyed their homes and livelihoods. No, what nettled her was that she had not thought of using the kin that way earlier. If she had, she would not be saddled with sea folk still, not to mention a bargain that gave up a square mile of Andor. Light! A square mile! Her mother had never given up 1 inch of Andor. Burn her! This siege hardly gave her time to mourn her mother. Or Lini, her old nursemaid. Ravin had murdered her mother, and likely Lini had died trying to protect her. White-haired and thin with age, Lini would not have backed down even for one of the Forsaken. But thinking of Lini made her hear the woman's reedy voice. You can't put honey back in the comb, child. What was done, and she had to live with it. That's it then, Casela said. They're making for the ladders. It was true. All along the wall, Elaine's soldiers were pushing forward, Aramilla's falling back, climbing through the crenels where their ladders were propped. Men still died on the rampart, but the fight was ending. Elaine surprised herself by digging her heels into Fireheart's flanks. No one was quick enough to catch her this time. Pursued by shouts, she galloped across the street and flung herself out of the saddle at the base of the nearest tower before the gelding was fully halted. Pushing open the heavy door, she gathered her divided skirts and raced up the Widdershin's spiraling stairs, past large niches where clusters of armored men stared in amazement as she darted by. These towers were made to be defended against attackers trying to make their way down and into the city. At last, the stairs opened into a large room where stairs on the other side spiraled upward in the opposite direction. 20 men in mismatched helmets and breastplates were taking their ease, tossing dice, sitting against the wall, talking and laughing, as if there were no dead men beyond the room's 2 iron-strap doors. Whatever they were doing, they stopped to gape when she appeared. My lady, I wouldn't do that, a rough voice said as she laid hands on the iron bar across one of the doors. Ignoring the man, she turned the bar on its pivot pin and pushed the door open. A hand caught at her skirt, but she pulled free. None of Aramilla's men remained on the wall, none standing at least. Dozens of men lay on the blood-streaked guard walk, some still, others groaning. Any number of those might belong to Aramilla, but the ringing of steel had vanished.
Give me 1
Most
second,
of the
everyone.
mercenaries were tending the wounded, or just squatting on their heels to catch their breath. "Shake them off and pull up the bloody ladders," Birgitta shouted. Loosing an arrow into the mass of men trying to flee down the dirt-paved low Camelin street below the wall, she knocked another and fired again. "Make them build more if they want to come again." Some of the mercenaries leaned through crenels to obey, but only a handful. "I knew I shouldn't have let you come along today," she went on, still loosing shafts as fast as she could knock and draw. Crossbow bolts from the tower tops struck down men below as well, but tile-roofed warehouses offered shelter here for any who could get inside. It took a moment for Elaine to realize that last comment had been directed at her, and her face heated. "And how would you have stopped me?" she demanded, drawing herself up. Quiver empty, Birgitta lowered her bow and turned with a scowl. "By tying you up and having her sit on you," she said, nodding toward Avienda, who was striding out of the tower. The glow of Sidar surrounded her, yet her horn-hilted belt knife was in her fist. Casela and the rest of the guardswomen spilled out behind her, swords in hand and faces grim. Seeing Elaine unharmed changed their expressions not a whit. Those bloody women were insufferable when it came to treating her like a blown glass vase that might break at the rap of a knuckle. They would be worse than ever after this, and she would have to suffer it. "I would have caught you," Avienda muttered, rubbing her hip. "Except that fool horse tossed me off." That was highly unlikely with such a placid mare. Avienda had simply managed to fall off. Seeing the situation, she slipped her knife back into its sheath quickly, trying to pretend she had never had it out. The light of Sidar vanished, too. "I was quite safe," Elaine tried to remove the acerbic touch from her voice without much success. "Min said I will bear my babes, sister. Until they're born, no harm can come to me." Avienda nodded slowly, thoughtfully, but Birgitta growled. "I'd just as soon you didn't put her visions to the test. Take too many chances and you might prove her wrong. That was foolish. Min was never wrong. Surely not." "That was Aldin Mihir's company," a tall mercenary said in lilting if rough Mirandian accents as he removed his helmet to reveal a lean, sweaty face with gray-streaked mustaches waxed to spikes. Priest Abalaman, as he called himself, had eyes like stones and a thin-lipped smile that always seemed to leer. He had been listening to their conversation, and he kept darting sideways glances at Elaine while he talked to Birgitta. "I recognized him, I did. Good man, Mihir's. I fought alongside him more times than I can remember, I have. He'd almost made it to that warehouse door when your arrow took him in the neck, Captain General. A shame, that." Elaine frowned. "He made his choice as you did, Captain. You may regret the death of a friend, but I hope you aren't regretting your choice." Most of the mercenaries she had put out of the city, maybe all, had signed on with Aramilla. Her greatest fear at present was that the woman would succeed in bribing companies still inside the walls. None of the mercenary captains had reported anything, but Mistress Harfor said approaches had been made, including an approach to Abalaman. The Mirandian favored her with his leer and a formal bow, flourishing a cloak he was not wearing. "Oh, I fought against him as often as with, my lady. I'd have killed him, or he'd have killed me, had we come face to face this fine day. More acquaintance than friend, you see. And I'd much rather take gold to defend a wall like this than to attack it." "I notice some of your men have crossbows on their backs, Captain, but I didn't see any using them." "Not the mercenary way," Birgitta said dryly. Irritation floated in the bond, though whether with Abalaman or Elaine, there was no way to know. The sensation vanished quickly. Birgitta had learned to master her emotions once they discovered how she and Elaine mirrored one another through the bond. Very likely she wished Elaine could do the same, but then so did Elaine. Abalaman rested his helmet on his hip. You see, my lady, the way of it is, if you press a man too hard when he's trying to get off the field, attempting to ride him down and the like, well, the next time it's you trying to get off the field, he might return the favor. After all, if a man's leaving the field, then he's out of the fight now, isn't he? Until he comes back tomorrow, Elaine snapped. The next time I want to see those crossbows put to work. As you say, my lady, Abalaman said stiffly, making an equally stiff bow. If you'll pardon me, I must be seeing to my men. He stalked off without waiting on her pardon, shouting to his men to stir their lazy stumps. How far can he be trusted? Elaine asked softly. As far as any mercenary, Birgitta replied just as quietly. If someone offers him enough gold, it becomes a toss of the dice, and not even Matt Coffin could say how they'll land. That was a very odd remark. She wished she knew how Matt was, and dear Tom, and poor little Oliver. Every night she offered prayers that they had escaped the Shongshans safely. There was nothing she could do to help them, though. She had enough on her plate trying to help herself at the moment. Will he obey me about the crossbows? Birgitta shook her head, and Elaine sighed. It was bad to give orders that would not be obeyed. It put people in the habit of disobeying. Moving close, she spoke in a near whisper. You look tired, Birgitta. This was nothing for anyone else's ears. Birgitta's face was tight, her eyes haggard. Anyone could see that, but the bond said she was bone-weary, as it had for days now. But then Elaine felt that same dragging tiredness, as though her limbs were made of lead. Their bond mirrored more than emotions. You don't have to lead every counterattack yourself. And who else is there? For a moment, weariness larded Birgitta's voice, too, and her shoulders actually slumped, but she straightened quickly and strengthened her tone. It was pure willpower. Elaine could feel it, stone hard in the bond, so hard she wanted to weep. My officers are inexperienced boys, Birgitta went on, or else men who came out of retirement and should still be warming their bones in front of their grandchildren's fireplace. Except for the mercenary captains, anyway. And there isn't one I'd trust without someone looking over his shoulder. Which brings us back to, who else but me? Elaine opened her mouth to argue. Not about the mercenaries. Birgitta had explained about them, bitterly and at great length. At times, mercenaries would fight as hard as any guardsman, but other times they pulled back rather than take too many casualties. Fewer men meant less gold for their next hire unless they could be replaced with men as good. Battles that could have been won had been lost instead because mercenaries left the field to preserve their numbers. They disliked doing it if anybody except their own kind was watching, though. That spoiled their reputation and lowered their hire price. There had to be someone else. She could not afford Birgitta falling over from exhaustion. Fight. She wished Gareth Bryn were there. Egwene needed him, but so did she. She opened her mouth, and suddenly rumbling booms crashed from the city behind her. She turned, and her mouth stayed open, gaping in astonishment now. Where moments before there had been clear sky over the inner city, a huge mass of black clouds loomed like sheer-sided mountains, forked lightning slashing down through a gray wall of rain that seemed as solid as the city walls. The gilded domes of the royal palace that should have been glittering in the sun were invisible behind that wall. That torrent fell only over the inner city. Everywhere else the sky remained bright and cloudless. There was nothing natural in that. Amazement lasted only moments, though. That silver-blue lightning, 3-tined, 5-tined, was striking inside Camelin, causing damage and maybe deaths. How had those clouds come to be? She reached to embrace Saidar, to disperse them. The true source slipped away from her, and then again. It was like trying to grasp a bead buried in a pot of grease. Just when she thought she had it, it squirted away. It was like this far too often now. Lavienda, will you deal with that, please? Of course, Avienda replied, embracing Sidar easily. Elaine stifled a surge of jealousy. Her difficulty was Rand's bloody fault, not her sister's. And thank you, I need the practice. That was untrue, an attempt to spare her feelings. Avienda began weaving air, fire, water, and earth in complex patterns, and doing so nearly as smoothly as she herself could have, if much more slowly. Her sister lacked her skill with weather, but then she had not had the advantage of seafolk teaching. The clouds did not simply vanish, of course. First the lightnings became single bolts, dwindled in number, then ceased. That was the hardest part. Hauling lightning was twirling a feather between your fingers compared to stopping it. That was more like picking up a blacksmith's anvil in your hands. Then the clouds began to spread out, to thin and grow paler. That was slow, too. Doing too much too fast with weather could cause effects that rippled across the countryside for leagues, and you never knew what the effects might be. Raging storms and flash floods were as likely as balmy days and gentle breezes. By the time the clouds had spread far enough to reach the outer walls of Camelin, they were gray, and dropping a steady, soaking downpour that quickly slicked Elaine's curls to her scalp. Is that enough? Smiling, Avienda turned her face up to let the rain run down her cheeks. I love to watch water falling from the sky. Light, you would think she had had enough of rain. It had rained nearly every bloody day since spring came. It's time to be getting back to the palace, Elaine, Birgitta said, tucking her bowstring into her coat pocket. She had begun unstringing her bow as soon as the clouds began moving toward them. Some of these men need a sister's attention, and my breakfast seems 2 days past. Elaine scowled. The bond carried a wariness that told her all she needed to know. They must return to the palace to get Elaine, in her delicate condition, out of the rain, as if she might melt. Abruptly, she became aware of the groans from the wounded, and her face grew hot. Those men did need a sister's attention. Even if she could hold on to Saidar, the least of their injuries were beyond her modest abilities, and Avienda was no better at healing. Yes, it is time, she said. If only she could get her emotions back under control. Birgitta would be pleased at that, too. Spots of color decorated her cheeks, too, echoes of Elaine's shame. They looked very odd with the frown she wore as she hurried Elaine into the tower. Fireheart and Magine and the other horses were all standing patiently where their reins had been dropped, as Elaine expected. Even Magine was well trained. They had the Wall Street utterly to themselves until Elise and the other kin walked out of the narrower way. There was not a cart or wagon to be seen. Every door in sight was tightly shut, every window curtained, though there might well be no one behind any of them. Most people had had sense enough to leave as soon as they caught a glimmering that hundreds of men were about to start swinging swords in their vicinity.
Give me 1 second, everyone. I'll be right back.
Twitched. A woman's face showed for a moment, then vanished. Some others took ghoulish delight in watching. Talking quietly among themselves, the 4 kinswomen took their places where they had opened their gateway some hours earlier. They eyed the corpses in the street and shook their heads. But these were not the first dead men they had seen. Not one would have been allowed to test for accepted, yet they were calm, sure of themselves, as dignified as sisters despite the rain soaking their hair and dresses. Learning Egwene's plan for the kin to be associated with the tower and a place for Aes Sedai to retire had lessened their fears over their future, especially once they found out that their rule would remain in place, and the former Aes Sedai would have to follow it too. Not all believed. Over the last month, 7 of their number had run away without leaving so much as a note, yet most did, and took strength from belief. Having work to do had restored their pride. Elaine had not realized that had been dented until they stopped seeing themselves as refugees wholly dependent on her. They held themselves straighter now. Worry had vanished from their faces, and they were not so quick to bend their necks for a sister, unfortunately. Though that part of it really had begun earlier. They once had considered Aes Sedai superior to mortal flesh, but had learned to their dismay that the shawl did not make a woman more than she was without it. Elise eyed Elaine, compressing her lips for a moment and adjusting her brown skirts unnecessarily. She had argued against Elaine being allowed allowed to come here, and Birgitta had almost given way. Elise was a forceful woman. "Are you ready for us, Captain General?" she said. "We are," Elaine said, but Elise waited until Birgitta nodded before linking with the other three kinswomen. She ignored Elaine after that one glance. Really, Nynaeve should never have begun trying to put some backbone into them, as she had put it. When she could lay hands on Nynaeve again, she was going to have words with the woman. The familiar vertical slash appeared and seemed to rotate into a view of the main stable yard in the palace, a hole in the air nearly 4 paces by 4. But the view through the opening of the tall arched doors of one of the white marble stables was a little off-center from what she expected. When she rode onto the rain-drenched flagstones of the stable yard, she saw why. There was another gateway, slightly smaller, open. If you tried to open a gateway where one already existed, yours was displaced just enough that the two did not touch, though the gap between was thinner than a razor's edge. From that other gateway, a twinned column of men seemed to be riding out of the stable yard's outer wall, curving away to exit the stable yard through the open, iron-strapped gates. Some wore burnished helmet and breastplate or plate and mail, but every man had on the white-collared red coat of the Queen's Guard. A tall, broad-shouldered man with 2 golden knots on the left shoulder of his red coat stood in the rain watching them, helmet balanced on his hip. "That's a sight to soothe sore eyes," Birgitta murmured. Small groups of kinswomen were scouring the countryside for anyone trying to come to Elaine's support, but it was a chancy business. Thus far, the kinswomen had brought word of dozens and dozens of groups trying to find a way into the city, yet they'd only managed to locate 5 bands, totaling fewer than 1,000. Word had spread of how many men Aramilla had around the city, and men supporting Trakand were skittish about being found, about who might do the finding. As soon as Elaine and the others appeared, red-clad grooms with the white line on their left shoulders came running. A scrawny, gap-toothed fellow with a fringe of white hair took Fireheart's bridle, while a lean, graying woman held Elaine's stirrup for her to dismount. Ignoring the downpour, she strode toward the tall man, splashing water with every step. His hair hung every which way over his face, clinging wetly, but she could see he was young, well short of his middle years. "The light shine on you, Lieutenant," she said. "Your name? How many did you bring? And from where?" Through that smaller opening, she could see a line of horsemen extending out of sight among tall trees. Whenever a pair rode through, another appeared at the far end of the column. She would not have believed that many of the guards remained anywhere. "Charles Guybon, my queen," he replied, sinking to one knee and pressing a gauntleted fist to the flagstones. "Captain Kindlin in Arundel gave me permission to try reaching Camelin. That was after we learned Lady Nayan and the others had escaped." Elaine laughed. "Stand, man, stand. I'm not queen yet." Arundel? There had never been so many of the guards there. "As you say, my lady," he said as he regained his feet and made a bow that was more proper for the daughter heir. "Can we continue this inside?" Birgitta put in irritably. Guybon took in her coat with its gold stripes on the cuffs and knots of rank, and offered a salute as she returned with a quick arm across her chest. If he was surprised to see a woman as Captain General, he was wise enough not to show it. "I'm soaked to the skin, and so are you, Elaine." Avienda was right behind her, shawl wrapped around her head, and not looking so pleased with rain now that her white blouse clung wetly and her dark skirts hung with water. The guards women were leading their horses toward one of the stables, except for the 8 who would remain with Elaine until their replacements arrived. Guybon made no comment on them either. A very wise man. Elaine allowed herself to be hustled as far as the simple colonnade that offered entrance to the palace itself. Even here the guardswomen surrounded her, 4 ahead and 4 behind, so she felt a prisoner. Once out of the rain, though, she balked. She wanted to know. She tried again to embrace Saidar. Removing the moisture from her clothes would be a simple matter with the power, but the source skittered away once more. Avienda did not know the weave, so they had to stand there dripping. The plain iron stand lamps along the wall were still unlit, and with the rain the space was dim. Guybon raked his hair into a semblance of order with his fingers. light. He was little short of beautiful. His greenish hazel eyes were tired, but his face seemed suited to smiling. He looked as if he had not smiled in too long. Captain Kindlin said I could try to find men who'd been discharged by Gabriel, my lady, and they started flocking in as soon as I put out the call. You'd be surprised how many tucked their uniforms into a chest against the day they might be wanted again. A good many carried off their armor, too, which they shouldn't have done, strictly speaking, but I'm glad they did. I feared I'd waited too long when I heard of the siege. I was considering trying to fight my way to one of the city gates when Mistress Zigane and the others found me. A puzzled look came over his face. She became very upset when I called her Aes Sedai, but that has to be the one power that brought us here. It was, and she isn't, Elaine said impatiently. How many, man? 4,762 of the guards, my lady. And I encountered a number of lords and ladies who were trying to reach Camelin with their armsmen. Be content. I made sure they were loyal to you before I let them join me. There are none from the great houses, but they bring the total near to 10,000, my lady. He said that as if it were of no moment at all. There are 40 horses fit for riding in the stable. I have brought you 10,000 soldiers. Elaine laughed and clapped her hands in delight. Wonderful, Captain Gaibon! Wonderful! Aramilla still had her outnumbered, but not so badly as before. Guardsman Lieutenant, my lady. I am a lieutenant. From this moment you are Captain Gaibon. And my second, Birgitta added, at least for the present. You've shown resourcefulness, you're old enough to have experience, and I need both. Gaibon seemed overwhelmed, bowing and murmuring stammered thanks. Well, a man of his age would normally expect to serve at least 10 or 15 more years before being considered for captain, much less second to the captain general, however temporary. And now it's past time for us to be getting into dry clothes, Birgitta continued. Especially you, Elaine. The warder bond carried an implacable firmness that suggested she might try dragging Elaine if she dallied. Temper flared, hot and sharp, but Elaine fought it down. She had nearly doubled the number of her soldiers, and she would not let anything spoil this day. Besides, she wanted dry clothes, too. Chapter 14. Wet Things. Inside, the gilded stand lamps were lit, since daylight never penetrated far into the palace, flames flickering on the lamps that lacked glass mantles. The lamps' mirrors provided a good light in the bustling corridor, though, and bustling it was, with liveried servants scurrying in every direction, or sweeping, or mopping. Serving men with the white line on the left breast of their red coats were up on tall ladders taking down the winter tapestries, mainly flowers and scenes of summer, and putting up the spring tapestries, many displaying the colorful foliage of fall. Always 2 seasons ahead for the majority of the hangings was the custom, to provide a touch of relief from winter's cold or summer's heat, to remind while spring's new growth was on all the trees that the branches would grow bare and the snows come again, to remind when dead leaves were falling and the first snows too, and days grew ever colder, that there would be a spring. There were a few battles among them, showing days of particular glory for Andor, but Elaine did not enjoy looking at those as much as she had as a girl. Still, they had their place now as well, tokens of what battle actually was. The difference between how a child looked at things and a woman did. Glory was always bought with blood. Glory aside, necessary things were often paid for with battle and blood. There were too few servants to carry out such tasks in a timely manner, and a fair number were white-haired pensioners with bent backs who seldom moved quickly in any case. However slow they were, she was glad they had willingly come out of retirement to train those newly hired and take up the slack left by those who had fled while Gabriel reigned, or after Rand took Camelin, else the palace would have taken on the aspect of a barn by this time, a dirty barn. At least all of the winter runners were up off the floors. She left a damp trail behind her on the red and white floor tiles, and with all the spring rains, wet runners would have been sprouting mildew before nightfall. Servants in red and white, hurrying about their duties, looked aghast as they bowed or curtsied, which did nothing for her temper. They did not appear upset to see Avienda or Birgitta drenched and dripping, or the guardswomen either. Burn her if everyone did not stop expecting her to be mollycoddled all the day long. Her scowl was such that the servants began making their courtesies quickly and scurrying on. Her temper was becoming the stuff of evening stories in front of the fireplace, though she tried not to unleash it on servants. On anyone, really, but more so with servants. They lacked the luxury of shouting back. She intended to go straight to her apartments and change, but intentions or no, she turned aside when she saw Rihanna Corley walking in a crossing corridor where the floor tiles were all red. The servants' reactions had nothing to do with it. She was not being stubborn. She was wet, and she wanted dry clothing and a warm towel in the worst way. But seeing the kinswoman was a surprise, and the two women with Rihanna also caught her eye. Birgitta muttered a curse before following her, swishing her bowstave sideways through the air as though thinking of striking someone. The bond carried a blend of long suffering and irritability, soon stifled. Avienda never left Elaine's side, though busily trying to wring water out of her shawl. Despite all the rain she had seen, all the rivers since crossing the spine of the world and the great cisterns beneath the city, Avienda winced at the waste, the water splashing uselessly on the floor. The 8 guardswomen, left behind by her sudden swerve, hurried to catch up, stolid and silent except for the stamp of their boots on the floor tiles. Give anyone a sword and boots and they began stamping. One of the women with Rihanna was Cara Defane, who had been the wise woman or healer of a fishing village on Tomon Head before the Shonchan collared her. Plump and merry-eyed in brown wool with embroidered blue and white flowers at her cuffs, Cara appeared little older than Elaine, though she was nearly 50. The other was named Jalari, a former Damani from Shonchan. Despite everything, the sight of her made Elaine's flesh feel cold. Whatever else could be said of her, the woman was Shonchan after all. Not even Jalari herself knew how old she was, though she appeared just into her middle years. Slight of build, with long, fiery red hair and eyes as green as Avienda's, she and Marilla, the other Shonchan-born Damani who remained in the palace, persisted in maintaining that they still were Damani, that they needed to be collared because of what they could do. Daily walks were one way the kin were trying to accustom them to freedom. Carefully supervised walks, of course. They were always closely watched, day and night. Either might try to free the Suldam otherwise. For that matter, Cara herself was not trusted alone with any of the Suldam, nor was Lemur, a young Tarraboner noble, collared when Chanchico fell. The notion would not come to them on its own, yet there was no saying what either would do if a Suldam ordered her to help the woman escape. The habit of obedience remained strong in Cara and Lemur both. Jalari's eyes widened at the sight of Elaine, and she immediately fell to her knees with a thud. She tried to fold herself into a bundle on the floor, but Cara caught her shoulders and gently urged her back to her feet. Elaine tried not to let her distaste show, and hoped that if it did, everyone would take it for the kneeling and crouching. Some of it was. How could anyone want to be collared? She heard Linny's voice again and shivered. You can't know another woman's reasons until you've worn her dress for a year. Burn her if she had any desire to do that. No need for all that, Cara said. This is what we do. She curtsied, not very gracefully. She had never seen a town larger than a few hundred people before the Shonchan took her. After a moment, the red-haired woman spread her own dark blue skirts more awkwardly still. She almost fell over, in fact, and blushed a bright crimson. Jalari's sorry, she almost whispered, folding her hands at her waist. Her eyes she kept meekly directed at the floor. Jalari will try to remember. I said. Remember what I told you? I call you Jalari, but you call yourself I, or me. Try it, and look at me. You can do it. She sounded as though she were encouraging a child. The Shonchan woman wet her lips, giving Cara a sidelong look. I, she said softly, and promptly began weeping, tears rolling down her cheeks faster than she could wipe them away with her fingers. Kara enveloped her in a hug and made soothing noises. She seemed about to cry too. Avienda shifted uncomfortably. It was not the tears. Men or women, Aiel wept unashamed when they felt the need, but for them touching hands was a great display in public. "Why don't you two walk on alone for a while?" Rihanna told the pair with a comforting smile that deepened the fine lines at the corners of her blue eyes. Her voice was high and lovely, suitable for singing. "I'll catch you up, and we can eat together." They offered her curtsies too, Jalari still weeping, and turned away with Kara's arm around the smaller woman's shoulders. "If you care to, my lady," Rihanna said before they had gone 2 steps, "we could talk on the way to your apartments." The woman's face was calm, and her tone put no special freight on the words, yet Elaine's jaw tightened. She forced it to relax. There was no point in being stubborn and stupid. She was wet, and beginning to shiver, though the day could hardly be called cold. "An excellent suggestion," she said, gathering her sodden gray skirts. "Come." "We could walk a little faster," Birgitta muttered, not quite far enough under her breath. "We could run," Avienda said, without trying to keep her voice low at all. "We might get dry from the exertion." Elaine ignored them and glided at a suitable pace. In her mother it would have been called regal. She was not sure she managed that, but she was not about to run through the palace, or even hurry. The sight of her rushing would start a dozen rumors, if not 100, each one of some dire event worse than the one before. Too many rumors floated on every breath of air as it was. The worst was that the city was about to fall, that she planned to flee before it did. No, she would be seen to be utterly unruffled. Everyone had to believe her completely confident, even if that was a false facade. Anything else, and she might as well yield to Aramilla. Fear of defeat had lost as many battles as weakness had, and she could not afford to lose a single one. "I thought the Captain General had you out scouting, Rihanna."
Hey Adam, how you doing?
The kin for scouts, women who could not make
Hope
a
you're
gateway
doing
large
well.
enough to admit a horse cart, but with circles of kinswomen available to make gateways for trade as well as moving soldiers, she had co-opted the remaining 6 who could travel on their own. An encircling army was no impediment to them. Yet Rihanna's well-cut, fine blue wool, though unadorned save for a red-enameled circle pin on the high neck, was decidedly unsuited for skulking about the countryside. "The Captain General believes her scouts need rest, unlike herself," Rihanna added blandly, raising an eyebrow at Birgitta. The Bond carried a brief flash of annoyance.
No, I don't draw for
Avienda laughed
anything.
for some reason. Elaine still did not understand Aiel humor. "Tomorrow I go out again. It takes me back to the days long ago when I was a pack peddler with 1 mule." The kin all followed many crafts during their long lives, always changing location and craft before anyone took note of how slowly they aged. The oldest
Be
among
nice
them
if I
had
was able to
mastered
draw for
half a dozen
comic books
crafts
that I
or
would have
more,
some money.
shifting from one to another easily. "I decided to use my free day helping Jelari settle on a surname," Rihanna grimaced. "It's custom in Shan-Chan to strike a girl's name from her family's rolls when she's collared, and the poor woman feels she has no right to the name she was born with. Jelari was given with the collar, but she wants to keep that." "There are more reasons to hate the Shan-Chan than I can count," Elaine said heatedly. Then, belatedly, she caught up to the import of it all. Learning to curtsy. Choosing a surname. Burn her if pregnancy was making her slow-witted on top of everything else. When did Jelari change her mind about the collar? There was no reason to let everyone know she was being dense today. The other woman's expression did not alter a whit, but she hesitated just long enough to let Elaine know her deception had failed. "Just this morning, after you and the Captain General left, or you'd have been informed." Rihanna hurried on, so the point had no time to fester. "And there's other news as good. At least it's somewhat good. One of the Suldam, Marley Neutchen, you recall her, has admitted seeing the weaves." "Oh, that is good news," Elaine murmured. "Very good. 28 more to go, but they might be easier now that one of them is broken." She had watched an attempt to convince Marley that she could learn to channel, that she could already see weaves of the power. The plump Shan-Chan woman had been stubbornly defiant even after she began crying. Somewhat good, I said. Rihanna sighed. In Marley's opinion, she might as well have admitted she kills children. Now she insists that she must be collared. She begs for the idam. It makes my skin creep. I don't know what to do with her. Send her back to the Shanshan as soon as we can, Elaine replied. Rihanna stopped dead in shock, her eyebrows climbing. Birgitta cleared her throat loudly. Impatience filled the bond before being stifled, and the kinswoman gave a start, then began walking again at a faster
Hey,
pace
free
than
weed
before.
man, how you doing?
But they'll make her a Damani. I can't condemn any woman to that. Elaine gave her warder a look that slid off like a dagger sliding off good armor. Birgitta's expression was bland. To the golden-haired woman, being a warder contained strong elements of older sister, and worse, sometimes mother. I can, she said
How's your
emphatically,
evening going,
lengthening her own
free weed
stride.
man?
Well, it would not hurt to get dry a little sooner rather than later. She helped hold enough others prisoner that she deserves a taste of it herself, Rihanna. But that's not why I mean to send her back. If any of the others wants to stay and learn and make up for what she's done, I certainly won't hand her to the Shanchan. But life's truth, I hope they all feel like Marley. They'll put an idam on her, Rihanna, but they won't be able to keep secret who she was. Every one-time Suldam I can send the Shanchan to collar will be a mattock digging at their roots. A harsh decision, Rihanna said sadly. She plucked at her skirts in an agitated manner, smoothed them, then plucked at them again.
Right, wasted
Perhaps
days,
you might
wasted
consider
nights.
thinking on it for a few days. Surely it isn't anything that has to be done immediately.
Nice.
Elaine gritted her teeth. The woman had as much as implied that she had reached this decision in one of her swinging moods. But had she? It seemed reasonable and logical. They could not keep the Sultan imprisoned forever. Sending those who did not want to be free back to the Shanchan was a way to be rid of them and strike a blow at the Shanchan at the same time. It was more than hatred of any Shanchan. Of course it was. Burn her, but she bloody well hated being unsure whether her own decisions were sound. She could not afford to make unsound decisions. Still, there was no hurry. Better to send back a group, if possible, in any event. There was less chance of someone arranging an accident that way. She did not put that sort of thing past the Shanchan. I will think on it, Rihanna, but I doubt I'll change my mind. Rihanna sighed again, deeply. Eager for her promised return to the White Tower and Novice White, she'd been heard to say she envied Christian and Zarya. She wanted very much to enter the Green Aja, but Elaine had her doubts. Rihanna was kind-hearted, soft-hearted in fact, and Elaine had never met any Green who could be called soft. Even those who seemed frilly or frail on the surface were cold steel inside. Ahead of them, Van Deen glided from a crossing corridor,
Nice,
slender,
free weed man.
white-haired, and graceful
I've
in
been
dark
smoking
gray
a
wool
nice
and
little
deep
bowl
brown
with
trim, and
wax
turned in
loaded
the
on
same
top.
direction they were going, apparently without noticing them. She
Give me
was
1
green
second, I'll
and
be
as
right
hard
back.
as a hammerhead. James, her warder, walked beside her, head bent in close conversation, now and then raking a hand through his thinning gray hair. Gnarled and lean, his dark green coat hanging loose on him, he was old, but every scrap as hard as she, an old root that could dull
Give me
access.
1 second.
Kirstian and Zarya, both in plain novice white, followed meekly with their hands folded at their waists, the one pale as a Kyrian and the other short and slim-hipped. For runaways who had succeeded in what so few did, remaining free of the White Tower for years, over 300 years in Kirstian's case, they had resettled into their places as novices with remarkable ease. But then the kin's rule was a blending of the rules that governed novices and those that accepted lived by. Perhaps, to them, the white woolen dresses and the loss of freedom to come and go as they chose were the only real change, though the kin regulated that last to some extent. I'm very glad she has those two to occupy her, Rihanna murmured in tones of sympathy. Pained caring shone in her eyes. It's good that she mourns her sister, but I fear she'd be obsessed with Adelias's death without Kirstian and Zarya. She may be anyway. I believe that dress she's wearing belonged to Adelius. I've tried offering solace. I have experience helping people overcome grief. I've been a village wise woman as well as wearing the red belt in Ebudar many years ago, but she won't give me 2 words. In fact, Vandine wore only her dead sister's clothing now, and Adelius's flowery perfume as well. At times, Elaine thought Vandine was trying to become Adelius, to offer up herself in order to bring her sister back to life. But could you fault someone for being obsessed with finding who had murdered her sister? Not that more than a handful of people knew that was what she was doing. Everyone else believed, as Rihanna did, that she was absorbed with teaching Kirstian and Zarya. That and beginning their punishment for running away. Vandine was doing both, of course, and with a will, yet it was really just a cover for her true purpose. Elaine reached out without looking and found Avienda's hand waiting to take hers, a comforting grip. She squeezed back, unable to imagine the grief of losing Avienda. They shared a quick glance, and Avienda's eyes mirrored her own feelings. Had she really once thought Aiel faces impassive and unreadable? As you say, Rihanna, she has Kirstian and Zarya to occupy her. Rihanna was not among the handful who knew the truth. We all mourn in our own way. Vandine will find solace along her own path. When she found Adelius's murderer, it was to be hoped. If that failed to at least begin assuaging the pain, well, that was to be faced when it must be. For now, she must allow Vandine her head, especially since she had no doubt the Green would ignore any attempt to rein her in. That was more than irritating. It was infuriating. She had to watch Vandine perhaps destroying herself, and worse, make use of it. Having no alternative made that no less unpalatable. As Vandine and her companions turned aside down another hallway, Rena Harfor appeared out of a side corridor right in front of Elaine, a stout, quiet woman with a graying bun atop her head, and an air of regal dignity, her formal scarlet tabard with the white lion of Andor's always looking freshly ironed. Elaine had never seen her with a hair out of place, or looking even slightly the worse for a long day spent overseeing the workings of the palace, and more besides. Her round face appeared puzzled for some reason, but it took on a look of concern at the sight of Elaine. "Why, my lady, you're drenched," she said, sounding shocked as she made her curtsy. "You need to get out of those wet things right away." "Thank you, Mistress Harfor," Elaine said through her teeth. "I hadn't noticed." She regretted the outburst instantly. The first maid had been as faithful to her as to her mother. But what made matters worse was that Mistress Harfor took her flare-up in stride, never so much as blinking. Elaine Trechan's moods were no longer anything to be surprised at. "I will walk with you if I may, my lady," she said calmly,
El
falling in
Paso.
at Elaine's side.
El Paso's in
A freckled
Texas, so
young
that's a
serving
whole
woman carrying a basket of
state
folded
next
bed
to us.
linens began to
El
offer her
Paso
courtesies,
probably,
only a hair
I don't
more
know.
directed at Elaine than the first maid. But Rena made a quick gesture that sent the girl scurrying
It's a
before
good
she
ways
completed
away.
bending her knees. Perhaps it was just to keep her from overhearing. Rena did not stop
Not sure how
talking.
many hours, but
3 of the mercenary captains are demanding to meet with you. I put them in the blue reception room and told the servants to keep watch so no small valuables accidentally fall into their pockets. Not that I had to, as it turned out. Cariana Sedai and Saritha Sedai appeared soon after and settled in to keep the captains company. Captain Mellar is with them, too. Elaine frowned. Mellar. She was trying to keep him too busy for mischief, yet he had a way of turning up where and when she least wanted him. For that matter, so did Cariana and Saritha. One of them had to be the Black Ajah killer, unless it was Marililla, and she was beyond reach, it seemed. Rena
oh,
knew
is
about
it?
that.
I think it
Keeping
might
her
be
in the
about the
dark would have
same
been
hair.
criminal.
Having a.
She had eyes everywhere, and they might notice a
It's
vital
been a while
clue.
since I've actually looked at it.
What do the mercenaries want, Mistress Harfor? More money is my guess, Birgitta growled, and swung her unstrung bow like a club. Most likely, Rena agreed, but they refused to tell me. Her mouth tightened slightly. No more than that, yet it seemed these mercenaries had managed to offend her. If they were stupid enough not to see that she was more than a superior serving woman, then they were very dense indeed. "Has Dialyn returned?" Elaine asked, and when the first maid said not, added, "Then I will see these mercenaries as soon as I've changed clothes." She might as well get them out of the way. Rounding a corner, she found herself face to face with two of the Windfinders and barely suppressed a sigh. The sea folk were the last people on Earth she wanted to confront right then. Lean and dark and barefoot in red brocaded silk trousers and a blue brocaded silk blouse with a green sash tied in an elaborate knot. Chanelidin Seren White Shark was aptly named. Elaine had no idea what a white shark looked like. It might well have been a little thing. But Chanella's big eyes were hard enough to belong on a fierce predator, especially when she took in Avienda. There was bad blood there. A tattooed hand raised the gold piercework scent box hanging on a chain about Chanella's neck, and she inhaled the sharp, spicy scent deeply, as though covering some foul odor. Avienda laughed out loud, which made Chanella's full lips grow thin. Thinner, at least. Thin was beyond them. The other was Renila Din Kellen, once windfinder to the mistress of the ships, in blue linen trousers and a red blouse slashed with blue, tied in a much less intricate knot. Both women wore the long white mourning stoles for Nesta Din Rias, yet Renila must have felt Nesta's death most keenly. She was carrying a carved wooden writing box with a capped ink jar set in one corner, and a sheet of paper with a few scrawled lines clipped to its top. Wings of white in her black hair hid the 6 gold earrings in her ears, much thinner rings than the 8 she had worn before learning of Nesta's fate. And the gold honor chain crossing her dark left cheek looked stark, supporting only the medallion that named her clan. After seafolk custom, Nesta's death had meant starting over for Renila, with no more rank than a woman raised from apprentice on the day she herself had put off her honors. Her face still held dignity, though much subdued, now that she was acting as Chanella's secretary. "I'm on my way," Elaine began, but Chanella cut her off imperiously. "What news do you have of Talan and of Marililla? Are you even trying to find them?" Elaine took a deep breath. Shouting at Chanella never did any good. The woman was more than willing to shout back, and seldom willing to listen to reason. She would not engage in another screaming match. Servants slipping by to either side did not pause to offer bows or curtsies. They could sense the mood here. But they shot grim looks at the seafolk women. That was pleasing, though it should not have been. However upsetting they were, the Windfinders were guests. In a way, they were. Bargain or no bargain. Chanella had complained more than once of slow-footed servants and tepid bath-water, and that was pleasing, too. Still, she would maintain her dignity and civility. "The news is the same as yesterday," she replied in tones of moderation. Well, she attempted tones of moderation. If traces of sharpness remained, the Windfinder would have to live with them. "The same as last week and the week before that. Inquiries have been made at every inn in Camelin. Your apprentice is not to be found. Marililla is not to be found. It seems they must have managed to leave the city." The gate guards had been warned to watch for a seafolk woman with tattooed hands, but they would not have tried to stop an Aes Sedai leaving, or taking anyone with her that she wanted. For that matter, the mercenaries would let anyone at all pass who offered a few coins. "And now, if you will excuse me, I am on my way." "That is not good enough!" Chanella's voice was hot enough to singe leather. "You Aes Sedai stick together as tightly as oysters. Marililla kidnapped Talan, and I think you are hiding her. We will search for them, and I assure you when we find them, Marililla will be punished sharply before she is sent to the ships to fulfill her part of the bargain." "You seem to be forgetting yourself," Birgitta said. Her voice was mild, her face calm, but the bond quivered with anger. She held her bowstave propped in front of her with both hands as if to keep them from making fists. "You'll withdraw your accusations, or you'll suffer for it." Perhaps she was not as self-controlled as she seemed. This was no way to go on with Windfinders. They were women of power among their own people and accustomed to wielding it. But Birgitta did not hesitate. "By the bargain Zaida made, you're under the Lady Elaine's authority. You're under my authority. Any searching you do will be when you aren't needed. And unless I misremember badly, you're supposed to be in Tyr right now to bring back wagon loads of grain and salt beef. I strongly suggest you travel there immediately, or you might learn a little about punishment yourself. Oh, that was entirely the wrong way with Windfinders. No, Elaine said, as hotly as Chanella, surprising herself. Search, if you wish, Chanella. You and all of the Windfinders. Search Camelin from end to end. And when you can't find Talan or Marililla, you will apologize for calling me a liar. Well, the woman had. As good as, anyway. She felt a strong desire to slap Chanella. She wanted to light. Her anger and Birgitte's were feeding one another. Frantically, she tried to soothe her fury before it burst into open rage, but the only result was a sudden longing to weep that she had to fight just as wildly. Chanella drew herself up, scowling. You would claim we had reneged on the bargain. We have labored like bilge girls this past month, and more. You will not cast us off without meeting your side of the bargain. Renila, the Aes Sedai of the Silver Swan are to be told, mind, that they must produce Marililla and Talan or else pay what the White Tower owes themselves. They cannot pay all, but they can make a start. Renila began unscrewing the silver cap of the ink jar. Not a note, Chanella snapped. Go yourself and tell them now. Tightening the cap, Renila bowed almost parallel to the floor, quickly touching fingertips to her heart. As you command, she murmured, her face a dark mask. She did not delay in obeying, setting out at a trot the way she had come, with the writing box tucked under her arm. Still fighting the desire to strike Chanella and weep at the same time, Elaine winced. This was not the first time the sea folk had gone to the Silver Swan, nor even the second or third, but always before they had gone asking, not demanding. There were 9 sisters resident at the inn at present. The number kept changing as sisters entered the city or left, and rumor said there were other Aes Sedai in the city too, and it worried her that none had appeared at the palace. She had stayed clear of the Swan. She knew how much Elida wanted to lay hands on her, but not who the sisters at the Swan supported, or whether they supported anyone. They had been close-mouthed as mussels with Sarita and Cariana, yet she had expected some of them to come to the palace if only to learn what was behind the sea folks' claim. Why were so many Aes Sedai in Camelin when Tar Valon itself was under siege? She herself was the first answer that came to mind, and that made her more determined to avoid any sister she did not personally know to be a supporter of Egwene. But that would not stop word of the bargain made for aid in using the Bowl of the Winds from spreading, and of the price the Tower had been committed to pay for that help. Burn her, but that news would be a bloody wagon load of fireworks going off at once when it became general knowledge among Aes Sedai. Worse, 10 wagon loads. Watching Renila trot away, she fought to steady her emotions, and tried to bring the tone back to something approaching civilities. She handles her change in circumstances very well, I think. Chanella gave a dismissive puff. And well she should. Every Windfinder knows she will rise and fall many times before her body is given back to the salt. She twisted to gaze after the other seafolk woman, and a touch of malice entered her voice. She seemed to be speaking to herself. She fell from a greater height than most, and she should not have been surprised to find her landing hard after so many fingers she trod on while she was... Her mouth snapped shut, and she jerked her head around to glare at Elaine, at Birgitte, at Avienda and Rena, even at the guardswomen, daring them to comment. Elaine prudently kept her mouth closed, and the light be thanked, so did everyone else. For her part, she thought she almost had her temper smoothed, the desire to cry suppressed, and she did not want to say anything that might start Chanella shouting and undo all her work. For that matter, she could not think of anything to say after hearing that. She doubted it was part of Atha Anmir custom to take revenge on someone you believed had misused their position above you. It was very human, though. The Windfinder stared her up and down, frowning. "You're wet," she said, as though just noticing. "It is very bad to be wet for long in your condition. You should change your clothes right away." Elaine threw back her head and screamed as loudly as she could, a howl of pure outrage and fury. She screamed until her lungs were empty, leaving her panting. In the silence that followed, everyone stared at her in amazement. Almost everyone. Avienda began laughing so hard she had to lean against a tapestry of mounted hunters confronting a leopard that had turned. She had one arm pressed across the middle as if her ribs hurt. The bond carried amusement, too. Amusement! Though Birgitte's face remained as smooth as his sister's. I must travel to Tyr, Shanella said breathily after a moment, and as she turned away, without another word or any gesture toward a courtesy. Rena and Rihanna offered curtsies, neither quite meeting Elaine's eye, and pled duties before hurrying off. Elaine stared at Birgitte and Avienda in turn. If one of you says a single word, she said warningly. Birgitte put on such an expression of innocence that it was palpably false, and the bond carried such mirth that Elaine found herself fighting the urge to laugh. Avienda only laughed the harder. Gathering her skirts and such dignity as she could summon, Elaine set out for her apartments. If she walked faster than before, well, she did want to get out of these damp clothes. That was the only reason. The only reason. Chapter 15. A difference.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. Definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.